sphere.
I'm hitting recording, and I'm going to share my screen in a minute. Thank you again, as the Sherman said, for being here, and also the Shermans and OSCAP for organizing. I'd invite everybody to mute their phones if they're not speaking, or mute their Zooms if they're not actively asking a question. I think that'll help everybody. So let's see, I'm going to go ahead and share screens and I'll introduce myself. All right. Okay, share screen. I haven't taught online since the pandemic. I was speaking on Zoom quite a bit. So it's like flexing some old muscles. Today's presentation is titled Remembering and Documenting Black Catholics in St. Louis Cemetery, Louisville, Kentucky. So I'm going to show you, before kind of getting into the meat of this presentation, I want to just say a little bit about myself. I've been asked to talk a little bit about kind of how I got into this work and how it relates to being an ally in racial justice work. Let me just say a little bit about that. I want to start with a story about a TV episode in 2015. There's a popular show called Finding Your Roots that's all about genealogy. It's hosted by Harvard's professor, Dr. Henry Louis Gates Jr. And really interesting program, usually features celebrities. And before the celebrities come onto the show, Gates's team of genealogists do a lot of research into the person and present them with this kind of bound black book that they can leaf through as he kind of narrates some of their. In this episode with Ben Affleck in 2015, Dr. Gates revealed to Mr. Affleck that one of his ancestors from South Carolina had been a plantation owner and had enslaved dozens and dozens of Black Americans. What's interesting about this episode is that after the filming, Affleck, who was deeply shocked when he was on air, put pressure on Dr. Gates to cut that section of the episode so that it wasn't aired and so that nobody heard about that, about his family history. So I think that's an interesting case study to think that just 8 years ago, this movie star, the celebrity at the top of his game, is really concerned that his family history from 170 years, 6 generations back, is something that could really do damage to his public image. So, and this kind of situation only came to light when WikiLeaks shared part of the script with the world through a kind of internet leak. So it kind of became a minor scandal when it hit. So I bring this up because in my own family, I've had some similar revelations. My family is very interested in genealogy and telling family stories. And that's something that I kind of caught the bug on. I started doing some of my own genealogy 7 or 8 years ago. And I found for myself a lot of genealogy is kind of digging into happy stories, right? Finding interesting things like ancestors on the Mayflower, or seeing if there's a tartan from from Scottish kilts that I can claim. Yeah, I can wear this. I can wear this. This is my family's legacy. What I wasn't expecting to find, indeed what my family had never talked about, was this history of enslavement in my Kentucky roots, indeed my Kentucky Catholic roots. So I wanted to just share some of that. And as a sidebar, before I say more about that, I'm using the terms enslaver and enslaved person in place of the words slave and slave master, which are kind of older terms. That shift is meant to honor the dignity and the humanity of the person who's enslaved. Remind the speaker and the listener that an enslaved person is first a person and never was property in the true sense. So I'm showing you here an image of a ledger with will in it. And I found a digital copy of my ancestor's, Edward Cameron, my fourth great grandfather. And I discovered 7 or 8 years ago a copy of this will. And as I leafed through it, I discovered these words. It reads, "In the name of God, amen. I, Edward D. Cameron of Marion County, Kentucky, make this my last will and testament. To wit, first, I will all my just debts to be paid, and for that purpose, Negro girl Anne, aged about 16 years, and my personal property, for so much is necessary to be sold and applied to pay my debts. After my debts are paid, I will the balance of my estate, including my land and my Negro boy Henry, and personal estate to my wife, to have during her life or widowhood. In case my Negro boy Henry does not act so as to suit my wife, she may sell him and put the money at interest, and the interest to be applied to schooling my children, or she may invest the money in another Negro to hold in the same way." So again, this was quite shocking to this, not what I'd come to family history to look at. And when I discovered it 7 or 8 years ago, I just kind of put it away. I put it out of mind. I didn't really want to look at this. I moved on to other branches of my family tree that had kind of happier stories. One thing I didn't mention, I also showed an image there of a great uncle a few generations back, who was a Confederate soldier who fought in Morgan's Raiders. So this was part of that kind of background that after I put this out of mind, I got to a point a few years later where I revisited it. And part of the catalyst for that was a big change in our city, was a really shocking event, the death of Breonna Taylor in 2020. And the death of Breonna Taylor, following on the heels of the death of George Floyd, really galvanized our community and really awakened many people to the reality of ongoing racism and racial injustice in our city and in our country. This is an image of the front of City Hall down in downtown Louisville. You can see an image of Thomas Jefferson in front, and there is the kind of center in Jefferson Square where months-long protests occurred. So these factors together, along with things happening in my own personal life that same year in 2020, I was going through formation to become a permanent deacon. I was ordained in August. And the year prior, in 2019, my wife and I welcomed triplets to our family, who, along with our oldest, became 4 children aged 3 and younger. So quite a lot happening in our life. Those family circumstances meant that though I really felt called to become involved in some of the protests, I really didn't have the ability. So what I did do was really start to educate myself about the history of slavery and racism more broadly in our country. part of that story meant looking at the history of Kentucky. In Kentucky, we have some really kind of comfortable stories about how kind and gentle slavery was. You've got these images of my old Kentucky home, which is an old plantation house in Bardstown. We've got you know, the song "My Old Kentucky Home" as well, that kind of glorifies this image of magnolias and moonlights. But the reality is much different. You know, I have here an image of a what's called a coffle, which is a word that was familiar in the 19th century. It's a line of Black human beings that are chained together in order to be marched to the slave markets of the Deep South. And this statue that you're looking at is on the riverbanks of the Ohio River. And it is accompanied by a quote from Abraham Lincoln. There's a piece of it that you can read here. It recounts an experience that that Abraham Lincoln had when he took a steamboat from Louisville, and there was a coffle line of enslaved African Americans that were on the steamboat along with him. And that experience shocked him and stayed with him, and proved to be a formative experience in terms of his own kind of conversion when it came to the issue of slavery, moving from a kind of gradual abolitionist to a abolitionist as the purpose of the Civil War. So that's you know, a piece of kind of what happened in Kentucky. If you go down to the Ohio River today, we continue to have steamboats that are a reminder of how many Black Kentuckians were sent downriver during our history, which, you know, Kentucky had more enslaved people than our agriculture could support. Part of that was by design. The enslavers in our state saw an incredible amount of value in these enslaved people and their value on the market. And so that expression, being sold downriver, refers to the reality of our economy, of selling human beings, of breaking up families and making a huge profit off of it. This was something our state, both our state government and our Louisville city government, were deeply entwined with. And, you know, as it turns out, so was our Catholic Church here in this state. And that became part of the question that I had as I looked into my own family history. I recognized that my Kentucky ancestors were a group of Catholics, a group of white Catholics that had immigrated from Maryland, bringing enslaved people with them and settling in central Kentucky. And that this was actually a reality that was connected not just with a number of lay people, but also to our priests and our bishops, to our clergy, to our religious orders. And I became very curious about that, and I went to look for the book on that topic. And much to my surprise, that book didn't exist. So I began to do my own research about it. One of the things I discovered was a news article, an obituary from 1908. And you're looking at the banner of this obituary. It's from a newspaper that doesn't exist anymore. It's called the Kentucky Irish American. And it's an obituary about a woman who lived to be almost 100 years old, 99 years old, named Mary Narcissa Frederick. She had been enslaved by one of the wealthiest men in Louisville, a man named James Rudd, who was Catholic and one of the founders of the cathedral. And this woman, Mary Narcissa Frederick, had been the nurse to his children and grandchildren, and had been a cook as well, and housekeeper. And when the bishop Benedict Joseph Flagey moved the diocese to Louisville, Rudd loaned Narcissa to him, and she became his nurse and servant during the last years of his life, the last 9 or 10 years of his life. So this obituary is interesting in a lot of ways. For one, it's very unusual in this period to find an obituary for a Black Louisvillian. It's also interesting in its length. It's almost 500 words long, and it tries to portray the community of Louisville as being deeply caring about Black people. And Narcissa is held up as an example of this, because she's given this kind of magnificent funeral where the white children that she had nursed in their infancy serve as pallbearers. And the article concludes with the statement, though her skin was Black, her heart was white. So you hear even in that kind of language, this sense of the partial humanity of Black Catholics during this period. So there's no images of her. This is a silhouette that I think represents her pretty well. Here's an image of another Black woman during this period who served as a nurse for white children. And here's images of her enslaver, James Rudd, and the first bishop of Bardstown and of Louisville, Bishop Flagey. So, and just a little bit more about Narcissa before kind of leading into the cemetery project. I could talk quite a bit about Narcissa, but she was a remarkable woman who could read and write in English and in French. That was one of the reasons she was loaned to Bishop Flagey, who was French. She also served as a godparent and confirmation sponsor and a kind of maid of honor in a number of weddings for Black Catholics in the Louisville community. She became a kind of godmother or spiritual mother to the Black Catholic community before, during, and after the Civil War. As I followed her story and I read about her obituary, I read that she was buried in a cemetery here in Louisville named St. Louis Cemetery on Barrett Avenue. And I went and visited the plot where she was buried, which is the plot for James Rudd and his extended family, which you can see a picture of right here. If you come into St. Louis Cemetery, there's this big pink granite obelisk that marks the family, and about 30 of their family members that are buried here. I discovered that Narcissa and her husband Thornton were indeed buried with the family, but they have an unmarked grave. It's right in front of the tree you see in this picture. As I continued reading about this family, I found that James Rudd had a ledger of the people that he enslaved. And there were an additional 45 Black Catholics that he enslaved, whose names and values on the market and their insurance value were recorded in his business ledger. I looked at their names and I found that a number of them also were buried in this cemetery. I asked for some help from Catholic Cemeteries, who manages the cemetery, and their program director, Caleb Beal, pointed out to me the section where these other members of the household, these other enslaved members of the household, were buried. It's a section in the back right corner of St. Louis Cemetery. It's called the East Slope, and I'll show you a picture of it in a second. Here's just a map of the neighborhood of Louisville called the original Highlands, where St. Louis Cemetery is located. You can see there's 3 other cemeteries, 2 of them Catholic, in the vicinity as well. So here's a Google map image of St. Louis Cemetery. And you can see it's laid out in rectangular shape. And this cemetery has been open since 1867. That's when the first burials occurred. And just looking at the layout here, here's another Google Maps image. The Fredericks that I mentioned, Narcissa and Thornton, are buried where this purple pushpin is with the Rudd family. And the other enslaved Black Catholics are buried in a section that's called the East Slope of Section T, which is in the far right corner as you come into the cemetery, the northeast corner of the cemetery. As I continued to look into this, I found that there was an adjacent section called the South Slope and another section called Section X, where more Black Catholics were buried. If you go into this section, you will find that it looks like an open field. There are almost no headstones for the people buried in this section. You could be confused or thinking that it's a section that hasn't yet been opened for burials. There are 12 headstones in this section, and there may be as many as 1,200 people buried here. Here's a historical photo, an aerial photo from 1940. And I want to just show you this one to point out in the back right corner. That's again where the East Slope is. And you can see that from this point that though there's not a wall on the back part of the property, this section has very clearly been segregated by trees. Trees have been planted to mark this off as separate from the rest of the cemetery. So you can kind of see that visual segregation. Though everybody in this cemetery is Catholic, either white or Black Catholics have clearly been set aside within this historic cemetery. Here's a visual of the ground level of what it looks like to be in the East Slope and South Slope of Section 2. As I said, you get a sense of just how open it looks. I brought a group of Assumption students here at the beginning of March on a kind of pilgrimage to explore this. They had just visited with me a former slave plantation called Oxmoor. And one of the things that was striking about juxtaposing those two places, at Oxmoor, there is a very big pet cemetery with big, elaborate, expensive markers for just a menagerie of animals that the Bullitt family owned. But you visit this cemetery of formerly enslaved people and the first generation of free Black people, and there's almost no markers here. There's very little sign that anyone is buried here. You can see one of my students looking at one of the few markers here. So this got me really interested in knowing more about the people who are buried here. I asked Catholic cemeteries for the records that they had. Kaylin Beal, who I mentioned, was able to provide a list of 690 names for people in the East Slope. And you can kind of see that they have a map that lays out by rows and by graves, the kind of burial spots. So in addition to these 690 names, each name was accompanied by a burial date and a row and grave number. And that's been very useful in helping to identify people and hopefully in being able to mark their graves going forward. So one of the things about this section is that people are buried in individual graves, not family. So the section in orange, that's the East Slope that you're looking at. If a Black Catholic died, they would be buried in the first available grave, whether or not they had family that had already died. And in fact, that's one thing that we see looking at these records, that a person might be buried at some geographic distance from relatives. There are very few family plots in the adjacent section called the South Slope, which you can see is SS here. There's 8 different family plots here. And those are some of the very few that have headstones. And I'll tell you about a few of them towards the end. Here's section X, which is another section of the cemetery. This section began being used around 1914, when the east and south slopes were filling up. So, and then by 1921, Calvary Cemetery opened, which is much bigger. It's also close by, and section 14 of Calvary was designated for Black burials. That cemetery and that section have a lot more headstones. So a lot of my attention has been focused on these three sections: the east slope, the south slope, and section X. One of the things I've noticed in putting this together, so I took those names that were provided by Catholic cemeteries and made this database, and lined it up according to a number of different kind of ways. One is alphabetizing people's names, but also trying to line it up by location, by those rows, and looking for gaps. And you can see here on this spreadsheet, highlighted spots where it looks like there might be a missing record, a missing person. So one of the next steps of this project is to look for places where people might be missing, and we can kind of where we can look for records to discover them. The goal is to find the names of every person buried here and find their burial location. So I'll say more about that. Another step of this project was to take those names and to create a family tree on ancestry.com, and with that tree to look for additional records that might give vital statistics and further details about their life. So for each of those 690 people, two of us, Rosemary McAdams and I, created these 690 trees, and then went and did that additional record. So that's been a next. So one thing that's different about St. Louis Cemetery that I wanted to mention is that it's not what's sometimes called a potter's field or a common grave. Each one of the people in St. Louis Cemetery, as far as I can tell, was buried with Catholic rituals, with a funeral mass and gravesite rituals. So that's a bit encouraging as compared to, you're looking at images of Eastern Cemetery here in Louisville, which is about a mile or two from St. Louis Cemetery, which this is sometimes called the most overburied cemetery in the country. So that's, St. Louis Cemetery is a different character than that. Here's a little bit of what some of the trees look like on ancestry.com. You can see up at the top that we've got 28 different pages, each one with 25 different family members, 25 different trees. So 25 people per page, and 28 of those. So it's been a lot of work putting this together with the hopes of building out those family trees and locating some descendants, helping to do that work. One of the things I'm not sure if I did mention, when I was looking into my own family history with Henry and Anne Cameron, who were enslaved by my ancestors, I found it was incredibly difficult to find out information about. And this is very true for Black Americans. Genealogy before 1870 is very, very tough. And some of the records that can be helpful in this are Catholic sacramental records. Catholics are very good at keeping records, and that's particularly true of baptism and other sacraments. And so those records can be brought in to help define this history prior to 1870. Can also be really helpful in finding the names of the white people that enslaved these families, which can help to trace families back to before the Civil War. So that's what these trees are starting to do. Here's an example of one tree. It's for Pius and Henrietta Mattingly. Pius was the son of a white man in Marion County, and his enslaved woman, and his grandfather on his death, freed him in his will. So he was a free Black person before the Civil War. He moved to Louisville with his wife and became an integral part of the Catholic community, helping to found St. Augustine Church, which is the first Black Catholic church in Louisville. He ended up living with the first pastor with his wife, John Lancaster Spalding, became a bishop himself. Henrietta was the housekeeper for Spalding, and Pius was the sexton of the church. That's one example. I've taken the information about these 690 people and been able to find a number of details about their lives, kind of sifting through the data and then analyzing it. Some of it is things like when people were buried. You can see that the 1880s and the 1890s were the most common time for burials to occur in this section, the East Slope. And then to look at when people were born. So 49% of the people in this section were born before the Civil War. 5% were born during the war. And then another 46% were born after the war was over. I think I've got the postbellum and antebellum reversed. Sorry about that. So that's interesting to kind of notice. There's a slight imbalance between men and women. There's more women in this section than men. There's 20 people, 18 of whom are listed as infants with no sex given, and then 2 with kind of indeterminate names. So that's part of that data. And then another interesting piece is to look at the age of death, age at the time of death, age at the time of burial. Well, I guess it would be death, right? But the time of death of people in this section, you can see that there's a really high infant mortality rate. There's 100 people who are born before age 1, before age 2, and then another chunk between 2 and 5. So between those two, 25% of buried people in this section were born before they reached age 6, 25%. Another really surprising number here is people in their 20s and 30s. You can see that 119 of the people that we have ages for died in their 20s. Now, I was looking into the kind of mortality rates at this time, and Black Americans between 1880 and 1910 could expect to live to be 38 or 39 if they survived to age 10. So that's a pretty short lifespan. But this lifespan for people buried in this section seems to be even shorter, right? A large number dying before age 31. On the other hand, we also see that people that made it out of their 30s might live to be into old age, in 70s and above. But a number of people buried here that lived to be 100. There was even one who lived to be 111. 5 people were born in the 18th century, so in the 1700s. So that's interesting to notice. Another piece that's kind of notable is, this one isn't surprising. 90% of people buried in East Slope were born in Kentucky. Another 5% were born in what we'll call the Upper South, Virginia, Maryland, Missouri. That's not surprising given that a lot of enslaved Black Kentuckians were trying to flee to the north during the antebellum period, either to northern states or to Canada. There's a thriving underground railroad network in Kentucky, Indiana, and Ohio. So, Black people that died in Kentucky were probably born there. Additionally, I mentioned the large diaspora of Black Kentuckians that were sent downriver to the Deep South. People in the deep South were more likely to, if they were going to leave that region, head to the north rather than stop in Kentucky. So you can kind of see that borne out in these statistics. Not everyone had their birth state mentioned. Even fewer had their birth county mentioned. Only about were available. But one thing that's interesting about looking at birth counties is that only 11 out of 100 were actually born in Louisville or in Jefferson County. Almost half were born in Nelson, Washington, or Marion counties. These are three counties, this kind of tri-county region in the outer bluegrass. They're known as the Kentucky Holy Land, because beginning in 1780, they had a very heavy settlement by Catholic immigrants from Maryland. And those were both white and Black Catholic immigrants. So, white Catholics descended from English immigrants who brought their enslaved Black Catholics with them into this region. And so we can see from that birth counties that a lot of the kind of enslaved people that had been born in these counties moved either before the war to Jefferson County with their enslavers, or after the war to Louisville and Jefferson County. And as it turns out, Nelson, Washington, and Marion counties were incredibly dangerous places to be a free Black person after the Civil War. There were a high number of lynchings and quite a bit of lingering Confederate sympathies. So moving to a city like Louisville provided some protection from mob violence, if not moving further. So we can see that kind of connecting to these birth counties. And then you can also see from this map that, places where Catholics have kind of a higher percent, with 15% or more members of a church that are Roman Catholic. You can see Washington, Marion, and Nelson, and then Jefferson County, and then some additional settlement in Lexington and in counties along the Ohio River and up by Cincinnati. So then I think this is the last bit of data. Another kind of piece that syncs with what I said about coming from central Kentucky and that region is the prevalence of last names from that area. So we see with people here in this section, a lot of common names like Jones, Miller, Smith, that are common to Americans, both white and Black. But we also see a number of names that are particular to white Catholics from that region, like Hamilton, Lancaster, Mudd, Rudd, Mattingly, Montgomery, and Spalding. And people in Louisville are quite familiar with these names as well. Those are names of a lot of prominent settlers in the kind of tri-county region that I mentioned, the Holy Land. And a lot of them were also wealthy slave owners. And we kind of can see that in those records. So knowing those last names is helpful in trying to connect people on the East to the families that had enslaved them before the war. I want to tell you about just 3 different people that are buried in the East Slope, and then about kind of some of the directions, future directions for this project. So all 3 of these people have headstones. The first 2 are named Madison and Kitty Smith, or James Madison and Catherine Smith. They were both free Black people before the Civil War, and they lived in Louisville. They were members of the cathedral. They worshiped up in the slave balcony in what's now the Cathedral of the Assumption. And Kitty served as a frequent godmother and confirmation sponsor, just like we saw with Narcissus Frederick. In 1849, there was a very strict constitution, new constitution passed in Kentucky that restricted the rights of Black people, both enslaved and free, and made life very difficult. During this time, the Smiths chose to relocate to Jennings County, Indiana, which is just north of Madison. There are records that indicate that while they were living in Indiana, they became a station on the Underground Railroad. They were instrumental in helping freedom seekers on their way north. Their farm was a place of shelter where people could cross. It's near Carrollton, kind of midway between Louisville and Cincinnati. And their farm was used as a place on that route. But they continue to maintain these kinship networks with Catholics in Louisville, so much so that they're buried here in St. Louis Cemetery in Louisville. One thing that's interesting about that, one possibility that's interesting, is that the National Parks Service and the federal government has a program that recognizes agents on the Underground Railroad with a special designation called the Network of Freedom. And that's one thing we're interested in applying for recognition for the Smiths and their role in the Underground Railroad. So that's one prominent group that's buried here in the East Slope. Another family, another couple, are William and Susan Spalding. They were, William at least was enslaved by a man named Dr. Ben Spalding in Marion County. During the Civil War, he enlisted in the U.S. colored troops without the permission of his enslaver, becoming a member of the 107th Colored Infantry. So he is one of 13 suspected veterans that are buried in the South Slope. There's probably quite a bit more when you look at 1,200 or more people buried here. But William has a pretty good documentary trail that indicates that he was indeed a veteran. So he's one person that we would like to honor and to get a military headstone for. Here's my son Max on Monday, right after he's put an American flag honoring William on Memorial Day. You can see Petra in the background too. There's another headstone of a girl named Lily Agnes. I don't know much about her except that she drowned in the Ohio River at age 12, and she's given this kind of touching headstone with a floral kind of design on it. So, and again, these are just 3 of the very few headstones in this vast open field that is the East Slope. Another thing that a direction to go with this project is really like to probe the ground to find the location of everybody that's buried in this section to get a good count of who, in fact, how many people are in fact buried here. Hopefully getting markers and marking those places where people are buried. So there is a new technology called ground penetrating radar that can detect where people are buried. It can also detect if there's some headstones that have been covered up by dirt. So would really love to get a grant to do that project. If you're in Louisville, you may have read recently or heard the story about the Zachary Taylor Cemetery, where our Kentucky president Zachary Taylor is buried with unmarked graves of 50 of him, potentially 50 of his enslaved people. So an ultimate direction of this project, again, would be getting markers for people buried in this section, either individual markers for everyone or a marker with the names of everyone on it. So these are some examples of that. In other cemeteries, there's also a news story here about a similar cemetery in Baltimore, and got an image of Cardinal Wilton Gregory from Washington, D.C., who's leading a prayer service for enslaved Blacks that are buried here. And would love to have some kind of memorial service or an All Souls Day in this section once we've done a little bit more research. And then a final direction that I've alluded to is getting headstones for each of the men that served in the U.S. colored troops. We've got a few more that served as Buffalo soldiers after the Civil War, and one or two that served in World War I as well. And none of them have military headstones. The Veterans Affairs Department does provide these headstones with the proper amount of documentation. This does take a lot of work, and that's, if you are interested in helping with this project or similar ones, learning how to kind of do the genealogical documentation is one way to kind of get involved and help with that. I would say for each of the 13 men that I mentioned, it could probably take about 10 hours of research and documenting to get the materials together to kind of verify that person's service. So that's another direction for this project. I want to close my presentation with a couple of quotes. I meant to open with one from our U.S. bishops as well, but I've got one on the following page as well. I think I just paused this. Hold on. Share. This is a quote. Yeah, still pause. Just a second here. Okay, so this quote is from Pope Francis, and it's from 2019. Pope Francis opened up what are officially called the secret archives in the Vatican, and particularly records relating to Pope Pius XII, who was the Pope during World War II and during the Holocaust. Had a kind of controversial role in the way that the church kind of responded to the Holocaust. In opening these archives, Pope Francis said, "The church is not afraid of history. Rather, she loves it and would like to love it more and better, as God does. So with the same trust of my predecessors, I open and entrust to researchers this documentary heritage." I like this quote a lot because the history that we've been exploring this hour is painful, it's uncomfortable, it's disturbing. It does not paint Catholics in a good light. It paints the kind of the heroic faith and endurance of Black Catholics in a good light. It does not paint white Catholics in a good light. And a lot of us would like to run away from this history or not think about it. But the Pope is encouraging us to embrace our history because God is alive in our history. God is present with us, and the truth will set us free. We believe in a Savior who is the way, the truth, and the life. The way, the truth, and the life. And the more that we live in that truth, the closer that we are to the Word of God, Jesus Christ. And our bishops on the same note, or a similar note, say in Open Wide Our Hearts, a pastoral letter that our Archbishop Schulten Faub here in Louisville helped to pen. This quote: "The evil of racism festers in part because as a nation, there's been very limited formal acknowledgement of the harm done to so many. No moment of atonement, no national process of reconciliation, and all too often, a neglect of our history." I think projects like this one, though limited in scale, help to tell part of that story and help to repair some of the damage of our 400 years of enslavement. Thank you for listening to this presentation. If you're interested in learning more or being a part of some of this work, I'd love to be in communication with you. I can put my email address in the chat. And I'd love to answer questions if you have any, either over audio and visual, or feel free to put some questions in the chat. So, I'll stop my presentation here and open it up to any questions you might have. Thanks.
That's great. Hi, Dad. This is Jennifer from, I'm dialing in from Atlanta, Georgia. And I was wondering, were you able to contact any relatives, living relatives of any of the buried, and any lines of?
Yeah, that's a great question, Jennifer. Thanks for asking and being present. So the kind of first stage of this project really been kind of surface level, putting together family trees and immediate family tree members. I would love to build some of those trees out to include descendants. I think when we start to do some of that work of getting veterans tombstones, that it's going to be easier to do that. It's going to be more important to do so. I'd love to have more connection with descendants at this point as well. But that really hasn't kind of gelled yet. So I think part of the process is going to be publicizing this a little bit more and getting more people involved too. This has been a project that I've been doing on the side. It's been a lot of my own efforts. I mentioned the help from Rosemary McAdams and kind of building some of the family trees. She's on the line too. We've also got Joanne Orr, who's been really important in connecting with the VA, and she's been really instrumental in getting some of those tombstones in another cemetery called Greenwood here. So thanks for the question.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you for all this work that you're doing. It's quite a labor of passion, which is fantastic.
I have to get my 2 cents worth in.
Thanks, Joanne.
Okay. My descendants is on that list. I'm a descendant of the Spalding family. I have reached back to Springfield, Bardstown, Lebanon Junction, and about 3 other counties and states here, counties within the states, family members. And I actually have them going through the old Bibles and diaries and seeing how much I can bring me up to, because within that Spalding family is a lot of Wakefields, and my father was Wakefield. So yeah, doing a lot of it there. Getting a lot of the military involved, a lot. As a member of the Kentucky Veterans Hall of Fame, I got that kind of reach out now. So, and I didn't realize that till a couple of months ago when Mr. Madley, Brigadier General Mattingly, I kept seeing that name up there, is the gentleman that has been helping me do all this research to get the tombstone. So he's thinking he's in there too somewhere. He's hoping maybe some of his ancestry will pop up as well.
Yeah.
And he's white. But when he saw it, he was like, oh my God. You know, he said, I know we're here somewhere. I need to find out where. So he's been working with me a lot on getting the veteran side of it done.
Thanks, Joanne, and thanks for all the work that you're doing. I didn't know about that Spalding connection. That's really interesting. I didn't mention that I also have Spaldings in my family tree as well, including our second bishop is a great uncle 6 generations back. So
to be cousins in there somewhere.
yeah,
We're all related. Correct me if I'm wrong, but when you do these family trees on ancestry.com, that does open up a whole opportunity for descendants to find their connections, right? People can take advantage of your good work and Rosemary and Joanne's work.
That's right. That's right. You know, the family trees that we've created through this project, they're all organized on one page. And we've called the account St. Louis Cemetery East Slope Project, and anybody can search the trees and find those records. One of the difficulties in building these trees, though, is that sometimes we just have the name and the burial date for the person in St. Louis Cemetery. And it can be difficult to connect that to family members. One of the things when people are buried in family plots, it becomes much easier if you've got another person with them. You can see, okay, well, this Patrick Smith is married to Annie. And now they go together. I can see marriage records, I can see census records. But for some of the people, all we've got are those 2 data points. And trying to find more can be quite difficult. Having their names and their burial dates is a lot, and having a location of where they're approximately buried in the ground is a lot too. So, especially in terms of creating a marker, but to help descendants find their ancestors can be a challenge, but it's important to try to do more with that. My own habits are to try to be very careful. I see a lot of wishful thinking in genealogy. You see one name that's kind of similar, and here's this other name. This other name is connected with this really important line of royalty or something. And I'm going to make this claim that they're the same person when that doesn't actually pan out. So, really tend to be a little bit more conservative in making some of the decisions about matching people in documents. So, but we've got a couple good outlets for that. As I mentioned, the Catholic Church keeps really good sacramental records, and a number of those records are starting to be digitized. And I think we can take some of these burial records and match them against those sacramental records. And that'll give birth dates, godparents, and the name of enslavers as well, which is a really important piece for tracing a person and their family back in the kind of pre-war period.
Is Yvonne on the call today? Yvonne from Lexington? I
I
don't think I
haven't seen her name. Yeah.
Okay, well, Yvonne is a woman who does some work similar to what Joanne and Ned are doing. And she shared a story last night. She worked 5 years trying to confirm that a certain person was who she thought he was so that he could get the military honors he deserved. And the glitch was he was an enslaved person who went to fight in the Civil War in substitution for his enslaver. So his name was not his name, in other words. It kind of blew my mind to think that people were treated with such little respect. But she eventually confirmed that this indeed happened. She found verification that he went in substitution for his master or his enslaver. And so he eventually got the honor of a veteran marker. So it's really interesting how this work upholds the dignity of a human being, which, I really appreciate. I appreciate what you do, Ned.
Thanks. I see this work as being connected to the works of mercy. One of the works of mercy is to bury the dead. And that's a way of honoring the dignity of the person that's died. It also has some immense value to the people doing the burial. And I think these people that are buried in this section of St. Louis Cemetery, they were treated as less than human during their lives. They were treated as property. They were abused. They were harmed. They were sexually abused. And here in death, there's no marker that they existed. We need to do better. We need to make sure that they are remembered, that their names are remembered, that their stories are told, to call them to mind and to testify that they existed and that they mattered. I think that's an obligation that we have as a community, as a city, and as a church. And that's a responsibility I feel as well as a descendant of enslaved people. I'm sorry, as enslavers as well. Yeah, Susan mentioned Yvonne Giles, who is working on a project in Lexington on another cemetery called African Cemetery #2. And she spoke for about 10 minutes last night and shared just quite a number of incredible things. One thing she mentioned is that we have a history of people vandalizing, breaking and removing veterans' headstones as well. I had never heard that before, but it sounds quite obvious now that I know it. Right? It's not a surprise, but it was shocking to kind of know that. So I see a couple hands raised. Eleanor Craig, did you have a question?
It's more like a comment. Ned, first of all, thank you a million times. This is so valuable. I'm a Sister of Loretto, the former archivist for the Sisters of Loretto. And it's we as a religious community who were enslavers and who spread the enslavement beyond the borders of Kentucky, as we ourselves went to work in Missouri and Arkansas and possibly Kansas. It's been, in my view, immensely important that we do the kind of work that you're doing in identifying individuals, because our own souls require that we recognize the humanness of each person. And our community requires that every bit as much. And because that's been the great loss and brokenness in our society, is not recognizing individuals, and that continues today. So what the work you're doing is just so crucial. I did want to mention, although I feel sure you know this, the project in Louisville called Reckonings, which has started a database, particularly of enslaved individuals who joined the Northern Army. And I wanted to add to that I had a very brief experience in the National Archives in Kansas City, the regional archives, where they hold an enormous ledger book of the person signing up for service in the Northern Army. And in that ledger book, it is clearly written if it's an enslaved person substituting for his owner, and very clearly written. And I presume that there are similar ledger books. As I understood it, it is the Kansas City Regional Archives, which holds the military records before the Civil War or up to it. And so that might be a source of more information, even for us here in Kentucky. Yeah. That's enough from me, but I can't thank you enough. And I hope that we can be in touch.
Thank you. Thank you, Sister Eleanor. I appreciate the work you're doing and what you've said there too. That's really valuable to hear. And I appreciate the work that your community and several of the other women's religious communities in Central Kentucky have been doing to tell this story as well. And that's something I'd like to see extended to the Archdiocese of Louisville. I see these religious communities doing it, but not as much the institution. And as I mentioned, a number of bishops and secular priests were enslavers as well. And as a descendant of one of the bishops and as a ordained clergy member in this diocese, I feel that responsibility myself too. You did mention a really good resource, The Reckoning Inc. They've taken a Kentucky ledger book and uploaded a lot of U.S. colored records that looks quite similar to the one you mentioned from Kansas City. And yes, they have been digitizing those sacramental record books, which is a huge gift as well. I hope they can continue to get funding and keep up that work, because it has been really valuable and is a kind of hopeful next step for the work that I've been doing to kind of compare the records that we've got. So thank you. Mary Jo, I see you've got a hand up as well.
I do. Thank you. Thank you, Ned, for all of the great work and for this sharing with us what you're doing. And I intend to email you separately because I would like to help. But my question is about, you just touched on it exactly, about how to get funding to keep the good work going. And you mentioned wanting to look for grant money to do the things like the ground penetrating radar and putting up headstones. Do you have a way of asking for donations? Is that set up yet?
No. So that is definitely a next kind of step. And I think for myself, a lot of my gifts have been doing in this kind of research work. That's been something I've been able to do just kind of, at my own speed. Sometimes, while the kids are sleeping upstairs, I can work on it, even with the TV on. But kind of doing this grant writing and doing some of the fundraising, that hasn't been kind of an outlet that I've worked on much. And I've kind of thought that once more of this documentation is done, then some of those pieces that take more money will kind of, those will be the next direction. So there are costs involved. I know with getting the veterans cemetery headstones, for example, the cemetery has a setting fee of $500 per headstone. So you can understand if there's 13 people that are getting headstones, that's going to be a considerable expense too. The ground penetrating radar could cost $20,000. So that's another expense. It could be thousands of dollars for one marker as well, with all the names. One avenue I'm investigating, I mentioned the Network to Freedom designation. If that can be really substantiated for those two Underground Railroad agents, the Smiths, that could provide a lot of federal funding. So that's what I've been working on this week, on summertime with the break from teaching, can work a little bit more in a more focused fashion on some of this work. But yes, the gifts of people that are good at fundraising and grant writing and networking is going to be much needed. And other people that like to do kind of genealogy research and historical research like this, that's also very needed too. Are there other questions that I can answer for you, or other? Oh, I see Anne is raising her hand. Yeah, go ahead, Anne.
Hi, I have a question. Since it was, I guess, the policy of the Catholic Church at the time to segregate Black people in a separate area, has there been any response from them, as with respect to this project, and sort of an atonement frame of mind, perhaps?
We have a new archbishop who has been here in our diocese for a little more than a year. He is the first Black archbishop in the diocese, which is an incredible thing. It's, when you think about our first 5 or 6 bishops being enslavers, to see a man who's a descendant of enslaved people in that office is really powerful. So there's some symbolism of that. I've met with him once to talk about this work, and I gave him a physical copy of the 690 names of the people buried in this section. And he took that list and he read through each name and prayed over each person. which was moving to see. In terms of action beyond that, you know, I haven't had conversations about a bigger reconciliation project, or I think that's definitely something that's called for. I've seen some movement from other dioceses like St. Louis to work on some of this. As I said to Sister Eleanor, I've seen a lot more religious orders like the Jesuits taking a lead on this, and the Sisters of Loretto. So yes, there hasn't been anything official about this from the Archdiocese of Louisville, and there does need to be, in my opinion. I think that's part of the process of, you know, exploring our own history and being honest about it. Yeah, thanks for the question.
When we spoke with him about the cemetery, and a number of us have spoken to him on a couple of occasions, he said that he wanted to put up one monument with all the names listed, and he wanted to try and have it together by All Souls Day, which I believe is November the 1st. I don't know if we're going to be able to pull that off or not. If so, that would be a lot easier, and the tombstones for the veterans could always come down the road whenever we get all that straightened out with the federal government. But he did make mention of that fact that by November the 1st, he would like to be able to put up something to recognize everybody that was buried there. So, and we're doing that same.
Good.
It was at St. Martin de Porres. I'm gonna say it's probably been about 3 months ago. He was down there at St. Martin's. And I spoke with him and Valerie Johnson, folks who was over our Parish Leadership Council. And we had spoken about it a couple of times, that he was aware, because I believe he had already spoken to you at that point. Yeah, that he was aware of it, and that in his mind, he knew exactly what it is that he really wanted to do. It was just a matter of what we were going to be able to bring him to determine what it was, that, because any way it goes, it's going to be expensive.
Yeah. Yeah.
So work it out.
Thanks for bringing that in. I appreciate that. It's good to hear that update. Let's see, there's another hand. It looks like John Cecil.
So Ned, a number of us on the call are from a parish in Chicago, Queen of All Saints. Are you aware, was the similar type of burial activity going on around the country? Or was it more southern states? Or and you know, if it is in Chicago, where do we start trying to figure out, you know, what happened?
Yeah, hi John, that's a great question. So I've read that segregated cemeteries existed until President Eisenhower's order to desegregate the military, which extended to desegregating military cemeteries. But that we actually continue to have cemeteries that are de facto segregated in our country. That principle wasn't really tested until the 1970s or 80s. If the principle being, if separate but equal no longer applies to people that are deceased as well, right? So I've been reading stories about a lot of cemeteries that are segregated, that are and that, you know, St. Louis is an example of one that has white and black sections. But I'm quite sure that, you know, every city in our country has black cemeteries that are neglected. And yeah, I guess asking questions of Catholic cemeteries in your city would be a way to start. seeing if there is a historic Black parish, looking into the records
Right.
of where their parishioners were buried. And then, this isn't just a question of Black Catholics, but also of Black people more generally. This has been a pattern of neglecting Black cemeteries, deliberately destroying them, and even developing them, building buildings on top of them. So I don't, this has been the one cemetery I've worked closely with. I'm aware of others within my diocese, but I haven't really looked at the question of how to get started on this in other places. But I'm quite sure that there are cemeteries there that need help and work.
Well, and it's practical to start with historically Black parishes in Chicago. That is very practical first step.
Yeah.
Either
Thanks for
that or just start with historical Black neighborhoods. In Louisville, the cemetery we've been working on, National Association of Black Vets, we've been working at Greenwood Cemetery 6 years now. And we have uncovered as many as, over 600 veterans. A lot of them had tombstones, but a lot of them have been torn down, worn out, sink down in the ground. You didn't know who they were. It was never really mapped out, but it was because it was in a neighborhood that was all Black, and it was considered a community cemetery that wasn't there was no upkeep with the city or the state. So we have, like I said, we've been at this 6 years now. We have finally hit over 600 veterans. And because of that, we can now go on the national registry anytime you hit 500 veterans or more. So now we have applied to go on to the national registry, and there will be money to take care of that cemetery. So you can look in that area too, the big, because a lot of them were communities, in the Black neighborhoods, a lot of them were community cemeteries, not necessarily, because my grandfather, though he was in World War II, my mother in just after World War II, neither of them were buried in national cemeteries. My mother is now in the Catholic cemetery because I had her moved, her and my father, both were military. But my grandfather stayed in the community cemetery down here at Greenwood. So that's why I said, just look around. At that time, that was the only place they could go here. So yeah, check out the African-American cemeteries, the old neighborhood cemeteries. You'll probably find a lot of them.
Thank you both.
Well, I think we've kind of come to the end of our hour and a half. I feel very inspired by Ned's work, Joanne's work, and by many of your comments and your questions. Remember, Ned put his email in the chat. If you don't know how to access the chat, just send a request through. Paul can connect you to Ned, because I think this work can certainly use many hands, right, Ned? If there's something any of us can do, if not the extent that Ned's gone to. But I just want to thank everyone for being here, especially Ned, for shedding light and truth on our history. It's very refreshing, even though it's a very sad subject. Ned, would you like to say some closing words and maybe lead us in an Our Father?
Sure. Let's take a minute and call to mind the presence of God around us and within us. Lord God, you are the author of all life. We thank you for the gift of all the human people in our family, those alive today, those who've gone before us, and those who are coming behind us. Help us to see in those who have died faces of the great cloud of witnesses that surrounds us. We ask for their prayers as we work on remembering people that history has forgotten. And we ask for the inspiration of that Holy Spirit that you sent in Pentecost to fill us with your gifts and to animate us with your love. Make this prayer in your name. Amen.
Amen.
Thank you, everybody. Thanks, Paul and Susan. Thanks for inviting me to come.
Thank you, Ned. This has been wonderful.
Ned, I do have a relatively simple question, I think. Has there been any evidence of any of these being double graves, or not? I wouldn't say mass graves, but you know what I mean?
I don't think so.
Okay.
Not that I've seen. I think I think care has been taken not to do that. That's why I tried to draw a distinction between this section and Eastern Cemetery, where that was just a real common practice, unfortunately. So yeah, I don't think so. I mean, doing some ground probes, either manually with a stick to check for depressions, and doing a ground penetrating radar, that would help to determine how many people really are buried there. I mentioned last night too that Catholic Cemeteries has a burial book with the names of everybody that's buried in the whole cemetery, with names and date of burial, and checking that, I think, would also give further verification. But this is a cemetery that has had, I would say, responsible stewardship and ownership and maintenance for the years that it's been open. So, unlike, again, places like Eastern Cemetery or Western Cemetery that have been, in the case of Western, abandoned and neglected, and Eastern had some really deeply unethical people running it.
And one last question: you recorded this, correct?
I did.
Is there a way to send me that recording, or tell me how to get it for anybody that might want to watch it?
Sure. Yeah, I saved it to the cloud, so I'll have to look to see where that went to.
Okay.
There's no rush. I mean, you gave such a great presentation. I would like to keep it available.
Especially for Father Judy and people that couldn't be here.
Yeah. I've also been working on typing up a written version of this information that can be shared too. So, and giving this presentation, being invited to give it, has helped me organize, big cloud of projects. So thank you for the invitation and the opportunity.
Thank you.
Thank you all. Thank you, Ned.
Thank you. And Adele, thanks for all your good work. I feel like this is going to go on near Chicago now. It's going to
quite a posse here.
You do. So you'll get some work done in the same respect.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye now.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thanks to everyone.
Have a good evening.
Thank you.
Good night.
Ned, I'll see you in a week or two, I imagine.
Yeah. Sounds good. Thanks again.